Hi guys, Rachel Hippolyte here. Today I'm going to talk about the power of the unconscious mind to protect you. And a lot of the issues, the mental health issues that we suffer from are the unconscious part of the brain doing its job in actually protecting you. So anxiety is a protective mechanism. Borderline personality disorder is a protective mechanism. PTSD, complex cptsd are all ways that your brain is trying to keep you safe. Okay, they are all based on old trauma. And quite often during the trauma, your brain copes because it knows that it has to. And you only then, when you are safe, so you're away from the actual trauma that happened in your childhood, that maybe happened in teenage years, that happened in adulthood. Once you're out of that, it knows it's okay to let go, and that's where you then get those symptoms. So at that time, during that traumatic experience, the brain becomes overwhelmed, overwhelmed and can't cope with integrating the processes. So things symptoms with regards to anxiety, borderline personality disorder, PTSD, all of these things will give you symptoms that are part of that fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, and often I forget to talk about the freeze, but it's incredibly important, and it's another way that the brain literally just shuts down and says, protect. I can't deal with this overwhelm. Okay, so that feeling of nearly passing out or fainting. Okay, again, overwhelmed, let's get you out of that situation. We can't deal with it. That feeling of not being part of the world, of being disassociated from the world. Again, these are poor integrations where the brain is just going, I need to protect you emotionally right now. That feeling of being numb of emotion, again, a protective mechanism. So this is where the unconscious part of the mind is doing its job. It is there to keep you safe, to stop you hurting. So it's doing its job really well. But the problem is when that trauma is over, but the unconscious part of the brain, because it wasn't able to integrate that trauma into the mind well at that time, the unconscious part of the brain can't comprehend that that trauma is in the past. It still perceives it as in the present. And so when we talk about these traumas, this is why it is so important to actually be able to deal with the trauma, to reintegrate the brain, and therefore the brain then can recognize that something is in the past and is not in the present, and therefore it stops giving you these horrific symptoms of disassociation, of numbness, of fight or flight, of freeze, okay? So please remember that rather than fearing your brain, fearing those symptoms, your brain's actually protecting you. So the more we fear it, the worse it gets. The more we fear it, the more the brain goes, oh, fear, I must be doing the right thing. I need to protect. And I just want to discuss with you an amazing documentary about resignation syndrome. It's on Netflix, or it certainly is over here in Australia. If you do get to watch it, this absolutely sums up the power of the unconscious mind to protect, to stop you when it is overwhelmed, to stop you when you are in danger. And this is the resignation syndrome. This documentary is called Life Takes Over Me. And in the 90s, they noticed this syndrome that was occurring in refugee children. So refugee children have generally seen absolutely horrific things. So their brain has gone into protect, okay? It's gone into protect mode. And at the time they cope with it. They then get to their refugee country. So really, they're safe at this point. But the problem is, when you're a refugee, there is still a huge amount of uncertainty. There's still a huge amount of not knowing whether you're going to be able to stay. So you're still not actually safe. So you're away from that initial danger. You're away from that horrific emotional, physical thing that you've been through, but you're still not safe. And what's happened to these children is they start withdrawing from life. They start withdrawing and not being able to process. They stop eating to the point where they actually become 100% catatonic. They are in comas. They have to be peg fed. They are so deeply unconscious that blood pressure doesn't change when ice is put on their tummy. Now, this they're now realizing, because it was occurring in number and frequency that they'd never ever seen before. This is a new syndrome that was suddenly being seen in numerous children, always children that have dealt with terrible trauma. Now, while those children were still in that uncertainty, where they would have been perceiving mum and dad being worried, they would have been perceiving fear and uncertainty. So bearing in mind that they are unconscious at this point, and this is a big understanding of how an unconscious patient still hears and still understands. So these children stayed catatonic for 12, 18 months, and the only time that their level of consciousness started improving was when they were given a refugee status. So at that point, they knew that they could stay. Now, bear in mind that these children are still 100% unconscious, okay? But they would have sensed a feeling of relief within the family. Something would have happened. Now, this to me shows the amazing capability of the brain, because it was at that point then their level of consciousness slowly over a few months came back. It got lighter and lighter, to the point where when they actually fully became alert and aware, they had absolutely no deficit at all. It was literally like nothing had happened. And these children have no memory of it happening. Now, the reason that I've shared this with you is just to show the power of your unconscious mind to protect you. Okay, now those children, we know trauma needs to be dealt with. We see it massively in PTSD, and this is why with PTSD it is so important early on, as soon as you can, to actually get that trauma treated, get that trauma, get the brain to reintegrate, to stop being overwhelmed, and to start realizing that you are safe now. This is no longer in your present. This is in your past. It's gone. It can't be changed, but you can stop it affecting your present life. So I hope you understand that. Please, if you have any interest in your symptoms, that documentary really summed up to me in such a eye-opening way the power of your brain to protect you. Thanks, guys.